and Tarcov for bringing us into this space, making that possible, and of course to Hannes and Tarcov for this whole project, and for conversations about the Euthyphro over time, and also Stuart, Warner for that, and Heinrich Meier for giving me the opportunity to give a public talk on the Euthyphro and discuss it with him and publish it as an essay, and to Wayne Ambler for sending me long ago, which I'm still pondering, a lot of hard questions about that essay.
And good questions.
Yeah. So, thank you. My one repetition is, I was thinking about the line that Strauss has in City and Man. He's talking about Plato's Theaetetus and how this crazy story of Socrates' narration being transformed back into a performed dialogue, and Strauss says, Plato lets us have a glimpse into his workshop. So who said that? Robin said. I was going to use the same formula. That's what's so great about the notebook, really. I haven't studied it carefully enough, but it is really so much fun to see the mind at work and just thinking through stuff. On the other hand, the thoughts I want to share today are coming from, I've gotten almost obsessed with the characterization Strauss gives in the 1952 lecture of the irritating half-truth. I think I've got some ideas about what's true and what's false about it. I want to start by saying everything I understand about the Euthyphro is totally based on and inspired by Strauss. But I think I might turn out to be a little bit of a heterodox Straussian here. So what I really want to do, I want to, maybe you can see from my head, I want to look at three passages, very briefly, way too briefly, three passages in the Euthyphro, the beginning, the middle, and the end of the dialogue, where I think I want to raise some critical questions. I can't tell at the end if I'm really supporting Strauss more or debating with him. Actually, I wish I could conjure up his ghost. What do you think? But I'll have to rely on you guys to channel it for me. So, okay, the irritating half-truth. Strauss's announcement at the start of the public lecture that the teaching presented through the Euthyphro is an irritating half-truth is a formula he does not use in the notebook. Now, that might seem to be explained very easily by the way he introduces it in this outline that he gave us, also interesting outline for a lecture, because he puts it there under the heading Captatio. And having just sat in on a dissertation on Aristotle's rhetoric, I now know what Captatio is. So I remember it immediately. It's a rhetorical device to try to capture the goodwill of the audience at the start of the speech. So I think, is this not typical Strauss? He had to be smiling that he's presenting an unpopular and irritating opinion in order to capture the goodwill of the audience at the start of the speech. What is he up to? That first copy puzzle. But I actually think this issue goes much deeper than just this rhetorical point. And part of the problem is, or maybe what makes it work actually, is we do not learn until the very end of the essay, the penultimate paragraph, what he thought, what this irritating half-truth is. And he tells us there, it's the emphasis on the ideas and the silence about the soul. So the falsehood, so the truth of the half-truth is obviously the primacy of the ideas, or the emphasis on the ideas. The falsehood is the suppression of soul, which somehow, and I think this must be the most difficult question, at least it is for me, which somehow makes the gods seem superfluous. So I'm very interested in how he got from this suppression of soul to the superfluity of the gods. As I say, the truth, on the other hand, is the primacy of the ideas as the highest beings. The ideas are the new gods, as I think Strauss puts it more clearly than anywhere in the notebook. But I want to consider now how Strauss arrives at that conclusion in three crucial passages I mentioned, which I have some problems with. So let's go to the first answer. And as you all know, if you didn't know before, you know by the end of this afternoon, one of Strauss's most brilliant discoveries, which seems so obvious once you hear it, is the significance of Euthyphro's immediate response to Socrates' query. The holy, we can talk later about why I'm insisting on using the holy and not the pious, but The holy is what I'm doing, literally making. That's something interesting with poetry, poiesis. The holy is what I'm doing now. His own action defines the holy because it's the action performed by Zeus. Socrates, of course, as you know, criticizes Euthyphro for giving a mere example, not a definition. But as Strauss shows, that could be readily corrected. The holy is imitation of God. Given the problem of many gods, Zeus can provide a standard only as the best and most just. Or as Strauss puts it, which is too hard to pronounce, the justest. But in that case, Strauss insists, we first have to know what is justice. That idea is primary. The ideas replace the gods as the highest beings. So I think maybe everyone in this room might agree with that except me. Now, Socrates will soon make that move. Definitely Socrates will make that move. But I wonder if Strauss goes too quickly here, and I think we might miss something. For Euthyphro, Zeus's action, based on the poet's story, on Hesiod in particular, is the primary standard. What justice is must be derived from that. The concept of justice he deduces from the holy action of imitating Zeus is the unqualified principle to punish the unjust. And the just performance of that means to him no differentiation of your own parents from anyone else in the city. The notion of justice that he draws from his most spontaneous and revealing definition of the holy entails, and I'll come back to this in the end, the destruction of the family and the city with that. Now, even if we acknowledge with Strauss the primacy of the idea here, I think that's very ambiguous, since the Platonic doctrine involves two notions, to which I think Strauss does allude in a notebook. And somebody in the back, I think, brought up earlier what I'm thinking of. To use the terms that I believe Plato regularly distinguishes almost consistently, Socrates is seeking the eidos, the form that counts as the defining characteristic of all members of the class. Doesn't seem to require any kind of separation of some other being. But the idea implied by Euthyphro's answer is a paradigm. It's a model to be emulated. Strauss speaks of imitating the idea of justice, which doesn't quite make sense to me. But imitatio Dei is imitation of God as a person with whom a human being could identify himself. And Euthyphro gives content to that by his most literal reading of the poet's God, who punishes the injustice of his own father. So we can come back to all that, but I really think that I understand how important and how significant Strauss's move is that this first answer should be the principal imitation of God. And it seems like a perfect exemplar of what Plato means by idea as paradigm. But I don't think it can be an idea like justice. It's really the God that he's teaching. So we can I'll go into the famous Euthyphro problem. At the pivotal center of Euthyphro, Strauss finds another basis to argue for the primacy of the ideas. Euthyphro's proposal that the holy is what is dear to God faces the first problem, as you all know, of a plurality of quarreling gods. I don't think Euthyphro realizes how important it is when he agrees with Socrates' point that the gods all love what they take to be just, beautiful, and good, and hate the opposites. Before that central argument, he's already agreed to that. But of course, their disagreement precludes an authoritative role for a defined standard. Socrates' friendly amendment to define the holy as what all the gods love leads to the heart of the dialogue, with the famous Euthyphro problem, which I think applies to monotheism maybe even more than to this plurality. You've heard it many times. As you say, students do recognize this problem. Is the holy loved by the gods because it's holy, or is it holy because it's loved by the gods? In the notebook, and this has come up before, Strauss makes some really interesting suggestions about what love means here, but that's not, I won't get too distracted. So I think what we have to ask, as Strauss does, is why Euthyphro, in response, once he understands the problem, fails to stick with his definition. He could have said that God's love makes something holy. And I think some of our conversation now suggests it's not so clear exactly that or how he would have then been refuted. But being an expert, Euthyphro wants to have the gods to have a reason, and some of the things we've been bringing up suggest that. He also just succumbs to Socrates' manipulation when he repeats the question. Socrates finally asks him, is the holy loved by all the gods because it's holy, or because of something else? That's not a fair question. If you were standing there quickly listening to this. Of course it's the holy. What else would it be? But Socrates has just indicated what that other ground would be. They agreed that the gods love what they believed to be beautiful, just, and good. So Strauss, I think, absolutely rightly emphasizes the conclusion of this central argument establishing the primacy of the ideas. But at the price of admitting the holy as an idea with no definition accomplished at all. I think this is a mistake. It's the result, I believe, of accepting a false dichotomy that central argument presents. When, as I understand it, it really involves what I'm calling a three-step dynamic. As Euthyphro should have maintained, it is indeed only the gods' love of something that makes it holy. There's no other meaning to holy. Holy is what the gods love, and that's what makes something holy. But their love was in turn the effect, as he agreed, of what they believed to be just, beautiful, and good. Those are the ideas that are primary. And Socrates then postulates gods who are moved by them. And in this context, the just in particular. And that sets up, I'd like to come back to this because I'm realizing it's more relevant from other people's talks than I thought. I'd like to come back to how that sets later in time, how that sets up the second half of the dialogue with the suggestion, or Socrates' question, are all pious things just? It's if the gods only love what's just, and that, but their love then makes it, enhances it, and making it holy. No, and you get that second. So this three-step dynamic, in fact, perhaps provides the strongest grounds for Strauss's important claim to the primacy of the ideas, since it's so questionable whether the holy is in it. But it also assigns a role to the gods in determining the holy. If human beings had knowledge of the just, the beautiful, and the good, or I think even if everyone spent their whole lives devoted to the quest for such knowledge, the gods would be superfluous. Except, as Strauss puts it at the end of the lecture, for the many. Obviously an important qualification. The many, that is the non-philosopher or the city, need the stamp of the holy as a sign of the divine approval of what is supposed to be just, beautiful, or good. So everything's flowing along, but there's a wrinkle here. The God's love or approval could provide an authoritative standard only if it were unanimous, which would be guaranteed, as Strauss reminds us, only if based on knowledge. That's why I like that notebook remark. This would entail a theology of God as pure mind. But Socrates does not ascribe to God's knowledge of the ideas, only opinions. So we're actually back, I'm not sure everyone sees this, we're back at the end of this, we thought we made progress, we're way back to the possibility of disagreement. But what I want to suggest is that reflects, I'm giving it I think a positive spin. I think it is meant to reflect two fundamental alternatives for the human condition. According to the poet's stories, the gods are at war, their quarrels make them enemies, and they hate one another. Boy, we know what that's like, right? But if we practice therapeia, improving the gods, improving the poet's gods, I think Plato's doing that. If we practice therapeia on the poet's gods and imagined deities engaged in dialogue about their differing opinions in a search for truth, wouldn't they be a fitting image for the Socratic philosopher? I know we're going to have to come back to the wise man God for my Nietzschean gods who philosophize. But if it's really imitation, yeah. So, I mean, I want to say that the absence of a ultimate single authoritative divine standard is such a boon for the philosopher. Final definition. I think the last definition, maybe it's a little odd how we count this through, but the last step in the dialogue brings us back to Euthyphro's first definition, where I also think Strauss's reading might be supplemented, although I only do it on the basis of a Straussian insight. Euthyphro, as you know, drew his own generalization from his imitation of Zeus. The holy is prosecuting whoever does injustice, father, mother, anyone. Euthyphro's half-baked state of philosophic enlightenment leads him to reject the convention of filial piety. But of course, it's not really an objective principle of punishing justice that motivates him. It's a very specific antagonism against his father, emulating the primordial generation of Hesiod's gods. I think the best clue I have it on the handout is Socrates' discussion in Republic 2, where he gives this exact example, he's examining the gods, stories of the gods, and he gives this exact example to warn against thoughtless young men who would justify precisely the action Euthyphro was undertaking with the claim of emulating the highest god. Yet Socrates slips into that warning very quickly in passing, the remark that such imitation would demonstrate a failure to understand the meaning, the hidden meaning of the poem. It's huponoia in Greek. So what Socrates really shows you is Hesiod had a real insight into the human soul with this account of the Oedipal plot of the primordial generations of gods. Had Euthyphro done that, and we can talk later, we've already talked about why Socrates doesn't push in this much, but had Euthyphro not tried to imitate Zeus on this most literal reading of the poet's story, but tried to understand what the poem indicates, he would have been led to some self-knowledge about the Oedipal plot he's in the midst of enacting and its terrible consequences. So at the very end of the dialogue, Euthyphro is at a loss to explain what the beautiful things are that come from our service to the gods, beyond the ends accomplished by each of the arts. Looks like all the arts cover what we need. As Strauss spells out in the notebook, and this I think is very important, I completely agree with this, it's the limitation of the arts in the face of chance that motivates our appeal to the gods. Our attempt, as he puts it so nicely, to control the divine art of providence by prayer and sacrifice. So, yes, and this is part of the answer, why do people need piety? Why is there at least a political and popular need for piety? So, yeah, our arts, we think we want nature, but chance is a challenge, and we turn to the gods and keep that in mind. Socrates homes in then on, quote, prayer and sacrifice, to end the conversation with a kind of mockery of piety as commercial exchange, justice, but commercial exchange. But, and here's to me the most really, I think, important thing. He calls attention to the answer Euthyphro brushed past with his claim that the holy things save private families and the city in common. They don't take that up. Socrates goes on to home in on prayer and sacrifice. In the notebook, Strauss tries out the idea that this saving of families and cities is the work of justice, or justice with the support of piety. But I would argue, I think, the action that initiated this conversation indicates a deep tension between justice and piety. I think that Euthyphro is pursuing a plan that would destroy the family by erasing the boundary that protects it from reduction to the city, while in turn destroying the city by turning it into one family. You know, of course, I learned this from Strauss's account of Aristophanes' clouds. But Strauss doesn't go in this direction, maybe there are other things more. The boundary that separates the family and city belongs to the sphere of the holy, whose most fundamental principles are the prohibitions against incest and patricide. Euthyphro's prosecution of his father violates, in some kind of symbolic form, the prohibition against patricide. And it's his universalization of the law of punitive justice that denies the independent sphere of the holy. And justice has to be universalized. So isn't that a conflict? I think there's a deep conflict. At the beginning of the conversation, Euthyphro was surprised and disappointed to hear the wise Socrates siding with his unenlightened family and rebuking him for the action he was undertaking. Now, Socrates may be engaged in an ongoing, perhaps unending, search for knowledge of the holy and its relation in particular to the just, which of course puts into question the gods of the city. I don't know about the poets. But, this is a big but, I think, Plato portrays the philosopher just before his trial, upholding in practice the principles of the holy that save family and city. I think that's Plato's response to the portrait of Socrates in poems. Let me conclude by returning for just a moment to the half-truth presented through the Euthyphro, through the action of the Euthyphro, and the very surprising claim that Strauss makes at the end of his lecture about it. The dialogue's sole focus on the ideas and silence about the soul leads to the appearance of piety as superfluous, except for the men. I would expect that Strauss would develop that qualification, but he doesn't. Not there, he doesn't. Instead, he highlights the falsehood of apparently dispensing with the gods. He drops the qualification. That's a falsehood. We are aware of that falsehood, he announces, because we know that there are gods. Not the gods of the city, but the living gods. And we know this, as you mentioned, based on demonstrative argument, starting from the phenomenon of self-moving motion. I think as Hannes notes in his essay, and many others, this is clearly an allusion to the first argument in Plato's Laws, Book 10, to show that materialists are the cause of all problems and that soul is primary in these perspectives. And I wonder, I assume Strauss must be thinking of how obscure the link is in the argument of the laws from the conclusion it reaches about soul to the existence of gods. It's very obscure in the laws. He's got to be thinking about that, I think. Certainly providential and just gods, but even designating the heavenly bodies as cosmological gods. Very unclear how to get from soul to gods. In any case, the closest anything in the Euthyphro comes to this primordial, self-moving motion of soul, I think, is the image Socrates offers in response to Euthyphro's complaint about the way his proposals never stay put. Right? And as Socrates puts it, their deeds in speeches, beautiful formula there, erga and logoi, their deeds and speeches, Socrates says, they're like the self-moving statues of my ancestor Daedalus. A little banter, who's responsible for setting the emotions of her. So here's my suggestion. If this is the unending motion of thinking, could the living gods, to which Strauss refers, be the philosophers?
So we have several. Maybe some more specific.
Yes.
To Ronna's. I have a small one about. In the outline, he refers to under the heading of why the many need the gods.
Yeah.
And the philosopher also needs the god in order to be respected by the many and accepted by the many. And in the Jerusalem and Athens essay, he downplays his role and says it's somewhat. It's like it's penal code and it's for children.
It's definitely
So that's the
part of the penal
context for it. Yeah. So it just seemed like it doesn't sound like that. It sounds like physics or something or
Why?
Yeah, but it's just based on the outline. I'd say it's a reference.
But Strauss has to know that whatever is used for many is not in that first argument of the clause. And then that's so tricky when that 3 steps in the clause in Bible because he kind of pretends that he's now showing the existence of gods and he can now show that they must care about human beings and he's not rival and so. But yeah, there's a lot of fun to play there. But what's going on with this self-moving motion of soul as the primary? You can see what I said before. You cannot dispense with gods, and so we still invoke the question, what is God? But ideas aren't enough if there even is such a thing. And of course, I'm assuming that Strauss means not necessarily these deified separate beings, but the order of the intelligible order that we try to gain knowledge of when we engage in inquiry. If we don't posit something like a question like what is justice or what is the whole, we can't perceive. But I do think that Euthyphro in a way is a denial of the whole as an idea, when I understand something. Yeah, but God's. So Strauss has 2 maybe very simple different formulae. The primacy of ideas, I think that's the truth of the half-truth of Euthyphro, for all the reasons we've been talking about. Without that, no philosophy, no inquiry, no gods anyone would ever worship anyway or follow. So that's the truth part. But the falsehood is that you can dispense with gods in some sense. Ideas wouldn't be enough. And this is in progress, I'm kind of just playing with some different ways of thinking about it. What is it that we still need? I mean, even if you just think logically, ideas need either mind or motivated soul to search for question knowledge. Yeah, you can't just leave out that step. So, and then we idealize it in the form of gods. That's why I want philosophizing gods, immortal gods, and differing opinions don't always have. Strauss makes it too simple, sound too simple. Quarreling gods means fighting. No, it doesn't. Just differing opinions usually do, but not amongst us here. We're not fighting. We're debating.
You fight if you agree. We're both on the same woman. And then you give things.
So,
I would like to add something to your distinction between piety and justice. Just as a supplement to what you say, I think this is a very important point for our dialogue. In The City and Man, Strauss emphasizes that piety is not discussed. So when Cephalus leaves, he says piety is not, so to speak, discussed as a part of justice. And it has a consequence which is supporting your point. The so-called just city is getting rid of the family, in any case for the warriors. So you have no family and you have incest, of course.
Oedipus.
You have incest.
Yeah.
So this is, I think, a strong point in this direction, that the sacred is not taken care of if you are only talking about justice. You may need the sacred in order to refer to something supporting justice in the end, right?
Exactly.
But in this distinction between piety and justice shows up in the Republic itself.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important point.
I think another point that I didn't want to go too long, but that people, I don't know if people disagree with me or just overlook it, and it's complicated, but it it's to me really important that we get two models for the relation of justice and piety at the beginning of the second half of the dialogue. At first, it sounds like we're all, and this is the line that everybody kind of takes, is everything pious must be just, right? So piety is a subset of justice. Fine. In the way that shame is a subset of fear. That would be fine. If we left it that way, we would draw our conclusions. But he doesn't. He adds another model. Why? He says odd. And you know odd is not all a number. Odd is a part of number. That's a completely conflicting model. Because that says that the genus really should be therapeutic, like number is divided into two mutually exclusive species, odd and even, neither, never, mutually exclusive, and exhaustive. So the genus should be, as Euthyphro says, therapia, or tendance, or care. And it's divided into two mutually, if it's on the model of odd and even, it would be divided into two mutually exclusive species, care of gods, care of humans. And they cannot overlap any more than odd and even number can overlap. So it's clear to me that Plato at least presents two models, goes out of his way to have Socrates present a second model to raise this question. But is piety really understandable as a part of justice? The way shame is a fear, or no, they are really mutually exclusive, caring for gods and caring for humans on the model of odd and even number. Oh, and one last thing, and the confusion because of Euthyphro in the end is what I think makes people overlook this. In the end, they end up with this kind of incoherent thing that justice is still assumed to be the genus, and yet once piety is care of the gods, what's the rest of justice? It's very confused in the end. The two models get conflated.
Two questions, they're related. Let me just state first at the beginning. Do you think that the dialogue, the Euthyphro, turns on the difference between imitating and making? Look, you see this, as you know, this odd difference between the Euthyphro and the Apology, that he says Socrates says at the beginning of the Euthyphro that he's being accused, he's being this graphe against him because he's a maker of gods, and then when you get to the second set of accusations in the Apology, he's a believer. So I wonder how much turns on making as opposed to imitating.
Yeah.
And these two things strike me as different. So,
well, I have to think of Book 10 of the Republic, the account of Nemesis of imitation, that, imitation is of at least originally of something made. Right? It's a double making, the making of the original and the making of the imitation. And I've been thinking about, everybody takes for granted, I think we all take for granted, Socrates introduces new gods and the ideas, that's Strauss's totally important contribution. And they aren't made, he's not a poet, he doesn't make the ideas. But in a certain way, I think you could make an argument that Socrates, or any inquiry, kind of makes the idea in the sense of postulating some what is question that allows the inquiry to unfold. So,
what I would connect it to?
but you can't imitate the idea of justice, can you? That doesn't sound right.
So taking the Oedipal theme that you underscored in your remarks and elsewhere, do you think that the beginning of the dialogue takes up this Oedipal character insofar as the corruption of the youth, or the blighting of the youth, or the blighting of these young shoots seems in some way from the very outset to be an exact imitation of the beginning of Oedipus Tyrannus? Right? You have Euthyphro in a certain way representing the priests that show up at the beginning of Oedipus Tyrannus. So if you want to emphasize this, it looks as if the dialogue is in some way an imitation that in some way is critical of holiness or piety as a kind of imitation, but it turns out to be something else.
And I think, I always alerted everywhere to how ubiquitous this Oedipal plot is in all of Greek thought, right? I'm still family drama of the son who goes with mother and his father is so dominant. But Euthyphro, it seems to me to be a comic presentation of it. You know, right. And by the way, I mean, Socrates says, and Meletus is the same thing. Going to the city like a mother to complain against me, the father. So Socrates is also the father figure in the Oedipal plot as he presents it. But I think it's this point in the end about you need the holy or the sacred to be the to uphold the principles of prohibition against incest and parasite, or you lose the family and then you lose the city too. And justice can't do that. Justice can't differentiate the holy and sacred.
May I ask one more question?
Sure.
So again, the dialogue, Euthyphro, is filled with this double ambiguity. And we sort of touched on it here or there. On the one hand, Eidos and Idea, which at C6D and 6E, he seems to go back and forth between the two.
I think someone does has Eidos once, but
Yeah, as if they're indistinguishable. And the same thing for Eusebes and Osia, which he seems to
you know, that I don't think. I think people need to differentiate this sort of thing.
Right, so I guess I'm asking, it's sort of curious in this dialogue, we keep talking about piety, but most of the definitions are not about Eusebes, most of the definitions are about Osia. And so you'd expect him to be so careful, Plato, so careful in distinguishing between these two sets, and he seems to almost throw them into a washer.
No, I think he is careful, and I think
No, I agree, that's,
Other-
yeah. Say so.
Because in 1971, Strauss wants to announces in a letter to Bernadette that he plans to restudy the Euthyphro, right? 23 years after writing this notebook. He writes, if I succeed in completing my essay on the laws, you almost did, I would like to restudy the Euthyphro. I have not been attentive to the difference between Hosiotes, holiness, and Oisedeia, piety. Do you know of any recent commentary or study which I might have a look at? That's so that sort of emphasizes that point. Strauss thought, after writing all the materials that we've been discussing, that there is something that he overlooked, right? So this is not definitive. This is not what he would have written in 71. So he would have somehow distinguished Hosiotes and holiness.
in a way, it's just a kind of common sense, almost linguistic point, right? Piety is a human experience or attitude or phenomenon. The holy is much more abstract, as you mentioned. I don't think you would ever kind of what is the pious? What is the holy? Maybe believe you're not after something.
You could have holy artifacts,
Yeah.
but you can't have
Holy sites,
pious
holy
artifacts.
temples, and then there's an interesting question whether there's a holy God. As you all brought up so nicely, there's no pious God, right? That makes no sense. And so imitation of God when it looks like impiety, and Strauss really builds on that. But holy God is, the argument was made that, well, that's another issue, whether the God of the Hebrew Bible is holy.
Yeah.
That's another issue.
Because I mean that's sort of just maybe to close that point. In the Machiavelli essay from 71, he starts by quoting Isaiah chapter 6 and sort of says that here we get Isaiah saying, I'm a man of unclean lips, and the reason is holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And then he says explicitly, Aristotle does not know the holy God. Right? There's no holy God for Aristotle. So it's quite interesting that he would have brought that into the Euthyphro. But I just have a small question about also about the violation of the prohibition of patricide committed by Euthyphro. Because in your own interpretation of the Euthyphro, you emphasize that Euthyphro has somehow been affected by Socratic philosophy. Right?
Yeah.
I think you write Socratic philosophy is in the air, and he has breathed in that element.
Yeah.
Do you think that's part of it? Is the universalization of
Yes.
justice?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I think maybe everybody would see this, that what is called a half-baked state of enlightenment is very dangerous because Euthyphro adopts the principle of Socratic philosophy, the implementation, but he infuses the content of his ridiculously literal reading of the punitive God. So that's the worst possible combination. And so Socrates is in a way being held responsible in some way. Is Plato having Socrates express, how about the issue of sacrifice? Maybe Socrates, maybe part of the idea of the dialogue is Socrates sacrifice. I think Socrates sacrifice was going out to the court and trial and accepting the death sentence and all those important things. But maybe part of it, Plato is showing you Socrates showing what it did. He's on the side of the fathers and the family and trying to bring back this crackpot to, reality. And so is this sort of against Aristophanes kind of defense?
Rhetorical.
Yeah.
Or do you think philosophy accidentally breaks the family? Because Strauss is the boiling point is when incest is suggested.
Yes.
But do you think what do you think that?
Yeah, I was
Is that
wondering
essential to
about that.
philosophy?
Yeah.
The question
Yeah.
is.
I didn't bring it. I don't think I bring them together enough. Like, on the one hand, it's clear to me that in practice,
Yeah.
Socrates is defending the sphere of the holy this way, and but on the other hand,
I'm not practically interested in incest.
practically, yeah. But on the other hand, I was emphasizing so much. I think Strauss needs you to also that on the other hand, what's in the air is the making of ideas, is the new gods, right? The ideas of the new gods. Euthyphro has no problem with it, right? He's somehow heard this before. What is X? So, but I'm not sure how to get from that to whether the questioning of these fundamental principles is an essential effect of Socratic philosophizing.
Or a core, not just effect, or even the core part of the core.
What do you think? What do you think?
Could you just repeat the last part that you said?
Okay, so on the one hand, I took, I think we all would say this, that the effect of Socratic philosophy in the air and has half influenced this crazy guy Euthyphro is the ideas. The ideas of the gods, right? And, so that's on one hand. But on the other hand, in practice, Socrates is upholding the sphere of the sacred and holy. But now, Zarko is asking, but is Socratic philosophy also somehow beneath it all responsible for questioning the prohibition of incest and patricide? What does Aristophanes think?
Wayne has an answer.
I don't. I have another question, of course. But go ahead.
Whoever has an answer gets credit.
But I think Wayne, maybe your question, and then we'll open it
My
up.
question was very basic. I was just wondering whether it's so clear that there's a powerful influence of Socrates on Euthyphro, because Euthyphro can be taught in a short period of time what the basic idea, criterion, category, fixed characteristic is. It seems more part of ordinary speech, I think, maybe because we can Socrates, I don't know. But it doesn't seem necessary to take the next step and say Socrates is responsible for this corruption on Euthyphro's part. He doesn't seem all that quick on the uptake.
That's for
And
sure.
it doesn't seem like that complicated an idea. I think that when you say A, B, C, D, E are all holy, that there's a common characteristic between them. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about that. You also, I think, fragmenticity may have implied is Socrates' influence on his society had to do with the idea of imitation and the importance of imitation. Maybe I misunderstood
Oh, I
this.
don't think it
Okay,
does.
then
But on your first point, I think that part of what influenced me is this very comical perception from that. Oh yes, I know Socrates, but you and I are in the same boat. They laugh, they mock me, they know pants because we're so special and so wise. So he doesn't imitate Socrates, that he assimilates him. Homoeosis Socrates, right? He assimilates himself to Socrates on that. And I don't know, what sort of struck me in the end most powerfully about that is that the very same stories or divine revelation through the poets that the city finds totally ridiculous in Euthyphro and Mass is this piety in Athens? And I think that pushes you to the question of the relation between the gods of the poets and the gods of the city. In a way, they're the same, but they're not the same.
But Euthyphro indicates that he accepts the Orthodox cult plus more.
Yeah,
So that would be one important difference between the side.
sure, yeah.
Not the
Yeah, and I'm rethinking, under the influence of Strauss, I originally thought, when Euthyphro says, oh yeah, I know why they're going after you for making the gods, because you have the daimonion,
right.
this living voice, and under Strauss's influence, I thought, no, that's not right, because that doesn't influence anyone else, it's really the ideas which have taken hold in so much. Sounds right. But now that I'm thinking more about this, not being able to dispense with living beings, or soul, or God, or something, ideas aren't enough. Maybe Euthyphro again sort of divine something true, that the daimonion is, in a way, a relevant consideration. It is part of what makes Socrates who he is and help condemn him in a way.
Lines. And I also want to just, did you?
I have a
indicate-
question.
Okay, so we have about 21 minutes and maybe 30 seconds for more questions. And they can of course be directed to Ronna, but also to any of the other panelists or general questions about the Euthyphro or the noble.
Well, something that occurred to me, I have two questions. The first one, and they are related, I insist, but I'm not sure what the relation is. But the first one is, with Euthyphro's first definition, I think it's, from my understanding of Greek religion, it's a far stranger definition than I think it's essentially a definition of hubris. I mean, hubris is saying I do what is left for the gods, and he said that's piety. So in our context, like the concept imitatio Dei, imitatio Christi, like it kind of sounds like, okay, well that's one thing you could think about the gods, but that's only possible because of the incarnation and all other kinds of things that I have no interest in. So I'm just, why is it possible for Euthyphro even to think that this is a reasonable definition of Greek piety? I mean, all of their myths are about people who think they're gods and try to do God's work and get destroyed. So I think that's like a big question that I have about the Euthyphro in general, and I just want to. And the second thing is relating to the earlier question where I think what was at issue was that got in my brain wave. The question was like on the stakes of a natural theology that would enable you to deny recognition of the gods. And when Professor Kerber, when you were kind of reconstructing that argument, you said a very powerful being. But I feel like the problematic changes completely if it's an omnipotent being, because if it's a very powerful being that's not omnipotent, then in some sense that very powerful being is subordinate to nature. Whereas if it's an omnipotent being, can you reasonably refuse recognition to something that you think is omnipotent? I mean, does that not change the problematic? And if it doesn't change the problematic, I'm open to that. I don't know. I'm just trying to think it through. So those are my two questions.
The more reasonably do it in a way. With omnipotence and wisdom, Videographer heading set up by law. Omnipotence and wisdom are incompatible. But the omnipotency of goodness is a kind of radioactive also thing that can, as soon as it tries to articulate that it's good, it destroys it. Strauss' examples of suicide or an atheistic God, or a God that decrees an atheistic cosmos forever.
Or creates another God.
Yeah, I mean, I know this says a little bit, but it's precisely the omnipotent God. It's easier because as someone very powerful and wise deserves your attention. But an omnipotent
I'm drawing on things that Professor Berger and Bartlett have already said, but not emphatically as an isolated point. And so I'd like to give a little push. And that is, I think it is a question whether it's correct to categorize Euthyphro's first definition of piety as being I'm imitating Zeus and leaving God. In fact, he does say I'm imitating Zeus, but he also says that both he and Zeus are following a law that it is just to prosecute the wrongdoer, and that the miasma, the religious pollution, will extend both to that wrongdoer and to the person who doesn't purify the situation by taking that wrongdoer forward. So I think the emphasis on imitation law allows Strauss to develop these radical implications of Euthyphro's first understanding, and then to supply even a more, point that Euthyphro himself didn't have in mind, that if God is a wise man, we should be like Gaisman, wise man, or something like that. In fact, it's not so clear, at least to me, and well, I won't say for some people, but I think to other speakers today, it's not so clear to me that it's adequate to define, to explain his first definition of piety as being I'm imitating Zeus, period. I think it's powerful language. It refers to the word law that he's following, and it implies that that's the same principle that Zeus is doing. And that's where the gods are likely to cause problems to you if you don't do something about it. That miasma is working. So, that should be something.
That's because it's of course not period. It's a halfway house. It's a mixture. So there's something that Strauss is extracting from this and takes it and runs with it.
It's striking. He really does run with it.
Yeah.
I think, as Hans pointed out several times, Strauss says Euthyphro has no idea that these are the implications of his remarks. And so his position is extremely radical as Strauss understands it. But Strauss also says it's unintended and half-hearted. So this is, a further reason for not conceding that Euthyphro is in fact not a fool. If he defends a position that can be explained as a radical and interesting position, but he doesn't intend that it be that way, let's not give him credit for it.
How important is it for you to deny that he's a fool? Because it says the folly equals the half-heartedness, and you say he's half-hearted. So why is it so? I don't understand why it should be important to you to deny that he's a fool.
I don't necessarily want to deny that he's a fool. The point is that I think what Strauss shows is that Socrates, in a way, takes him more seriously than you would take a fool, right? And you can see the consequences of condemning him to be a fool in what, as far as I can see, all other Plato scholars do when they write about the Euthyphro, namely not taking the first definition Wayne suggests correctly, maybe as important as Strauss makes it. And I think that is sort of, that's a characteristic feature of his interpretation of the Euthyphro. But I mean, I also want to maintain, when he calls him an expert in piety in the last restatement, I don't think that's entirely free from irony. Yeah.
But I had something to write. He does refer to the law punishing them just, but he's got everything so mixed up. This miasma thing, as we know from Plato's laws, is supposed to be, if you're the relative of the victim, you'll be incurring pollution if you don't purify. So he's got it all mixed up. He's treating his own worker or servant, whatever, slave, as though that were his family and prosecuting his father. So my conclusion I draw is that he might refer to the law, and he does refer to this universal law punishing unjust, but really what Plato is showing you is he's enacting what he should understood about the antagonism of the son to the father. It's very,
But is it done knowingly? In this attack on the family? Still don't understand the Republic attacks the family, what is the, how do you understand that there?
I think we've got Congress and his mother.
It doesn't seem to go, well, yeah, that's the biggest thing. It doesn't go philosophically.
But we're getting a glimpse into the worship of his soul, right? What is going on in his deed.
So what is the Socratic treatment of the Oedipus story? What is interpretation? What is it about?
Tyrant.
Says,
That's what he says in the time. Everybody dreams of sleep. Every man dreams of sleeping with his mother. So it's fun. My students go, I didn't know the dream.
I see. But are you violating the moral law in the service of some kind of moralism, or is it just pure and simple violation of the moral law? The transgression.
You want to follow the world?
I don't remember.
Yeah, honor thy father and thy mother. You can't treat your father and mother as though they're any other indifferent individual.
If the neighboring mother is better than your mother,
Nevertheless,
something's
it's
wrong.
not yours.
Any other questions we have? Yes.
Maybe just to analyze this. On the controversial issue we came to, is if I understood crudely, but just if we have a position where we say that in the fight between reason and revelation, that the philosophical life means being open to either answer in some way and not trying to resolve it. We've got that famous statement from Strauss in Natural Relative History, where he, I think it speaks very, very basically, he comes out and says, reason has to prove its principle, and revelation doesn't. If it's left as some kind of standoff between these two titans, it's the victory of revelation. So the idea of the philosophical life is just based on pursuing these endless questions, and neither side can give a definitive answer or defend the philosophical life or establish the reasonableness of the philosophical life. It would be the victory of revelation. So from that standpoint, it can't our whole activity cannot be based on the idea that it's a standoff. And I wonder if that has an appeal to you, or you see
There
still
can't be a standard.
it can't.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that really what we've been going around? It can't be a stand-up because that's the victory of revelation, or any thought really. Anyone who says I've had an experience, right?
Yeah, I can speak about how wonderful a question I think that is. I don't know that I can answer it. I think Professor Bartlett could do a better job of that. But I had very much this question in mind when I cited what I took to be 3 passages in the Euthyphro lecture that stressed the importance of thinking itself. And I presented them in my remarks as being attractive and suggesting the nobility of the philosophical life. But I wanted to imply by the word nobility that it didn't necessarily imply the superiority of it yet, that would require a further and more complete defense, and one that I don't know exactly that I could ever give. I do think that Strauss is not willing to leave it on a tentative defense, but I'm not quite competent to present myself. I do think that you put your finger on absolutely critical critical issue. I just wanted to read this line this is from the very first paragraph of the lecture that impressed me very much. And he speaks of the Euthyphro's teaching a half-truth, kind of rather unpopular, unattractive one. It's an irritating one, he says. he says an irritating half-truth is more valuable and better for us than a half-truth that is not irritating because it makes us think. And it's in this thinking then that it presents its utility. And he says, it is most unsatisfactory if we are first forced to think and then to receive no other reward than an irritating provisional result. I'm sure I'm not alone in having had this experience. You work hard, you want to resolve a question, and not only do you not resolve the question, but you don't get the result. You're not even getting pledged to the result of it. Even though you wanted to be objective about it, the result that you wanted to get in the first place. And in this respect, he says Plato gives us two kinds of comfort. One kind of comfort is that thinking itself may be the most satisfying activity there is. I think that's quite attractive, and I'm moved by it, and I think he's serious about it, but I'm just going to come back and say I think you're absolutely right. In the end, I can't really end it. There has to be further steps taken.
Just very quickly, I agree with what you say, and that I'm more persuaded by those statements of his, where he states that a kind of standoff, to use your term, is adequate. It's the very, in a way, beautiful statement about the two strands of the West, their tension and so on, provided we live that tension. But I'm inclined to believe that finally was not his view. But just think about the question that we're now discussing. How awesome it is to try to grapple with this. And if we're honest with ourselves, many of us would have to say that we haven't satisfactorily solved it. And to be honest about ourselves about that, but not to try to flinch either. So I'm persuaded by what you say, and I didn't mean to suggest otherwise in my remarks. I'm of the party that the ancients may well be solving difficult to the extent that we can in our doings, but adequately in a manner adequate for life.
Just, if I could just add just one small aspect to it. You know, Strauss has many very beautiful statements about the continuing tension between and the vitality of the rest. But what I think we have to be persuaded by are arguments. And is it a logical argument that can you have this standoff and defend the philosophical life? And I am persuaded by the logic of the argument that if you leave it at a standoff, you have given victory to revelation. So, in a way, it doesn't matter whether Strauss is right or wrong. What I mean by that is, it's the question of the logic behind it. Does Strauss have an argument, and do we have a counter argument, not a sentiment? And I think you could work through what is a logical argument in Strauss. I think the tradition that even came out of in Germany, that's why they said, no, philosophy might not really be possible because you can't argue against revelation. And in which case philosophy or the philosophical life really isn't possible. So it's not a question of all those beautiful statements, but a question of a logical argument, and then we have to take it seriously. Either philosophy is possible or the philosophical life is tenable. It's not.
And the book does have it's filled with logical arguments.
Buy it.
Stuart, what better than to end with my colleague, Stuart?
I think this gets back to what everybody's saying. If we look at the first paragraph of the 1952 lecture, the idea of a half-truth or a partial truth shows up 11 times. And if we were composition professors, I think we'd say, you've said it once or you've said it twice, but he keeps harping on this, and he connects it with what I think he takes to be the philosophical activity, which is thinking. But what is thinking, if we're guided by the dialogues, it's asking questions. And thus partial truths, half-truths there's always another question to ask. There's yet another question to ask. ask, and there's never a conclusion to the questions. And I wonder if one way we might think about the relationship between philosophy on the one hand and theology or revelation on the other hand is, for which do questions come to an end and for which don't they?
I'm sympathetic to a lot of what has been said, and I also love thinking. So, but I think it's important to also remind ourselves that revelation is not just one more problem on the table, right? It's the theologians who most consistently articulated what I would call, described as an orthodox position, have also said that their position implies that asking these questions is prohibited, right? So philosophy is challenged not just in sort of by posing interesting questions and puzzles and sort of yet another issue that we have to deal with, but it's also an existential challenge that we have to face, and we have to justify the very way of life that philosophy claims to be by asking this. One expression, to just bring it back to the notebook for a second, is Strauss says, precisely because we do not know what piety is, because we do not know what the most important things are, this is in a way a justification of our quest for the most important things, right? This might not be a sufficient justification of philosophy facing a challenge of the magnitude of revelation, but I think this question is sort of, I just don't want to leave it at asking important questions and half-truths and thinking and spinning a web is what we have to do. This philosophy, in its confrontation with revealed religion, is challenged existentially and needs to defend itself existentially. With the MC.
We're going to continue informally the conversations.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all very much.
You will like this out. Yes. So,
I might go around.